Welcome, my name is Chris Impey. I'm a professor of astronomy at the University of Arizona. And in this presentation, I want to talk about addressing the pandemic of science misinformation online. That's the second pandemic we've been dealing with recently, and that's one that preceded the pandemic of COVID. It's the increase in the amount of fake news and other forms of misinformation, especially in science on the internet. It's a plague of our time and something that science educators and communicators have to deal with all the time. Public trust in scientists is high. That's the good news. You can see here, and many of my numbers will come from the United States, but they're not that much different in Europe or other industrialized countries, that trust in the scientific profession is held high and steady over the past few decades. In fact, in the United States, falling just slightly below the military, and far above educators in general and the press, which is a bad sign for democracy, of course. So science faith and confidence is high, and yet the people who believe that scientists know what they're doing and trust the role of science in society believe some strange things. Here are some examples of paranormal beliefs believed by many Americans. They're familiar things like pseudoscience, superstitions, and especially the belief in alien visitation that all astronomers know about only too well. But more concerning for scientists and for civic-minded people is the level of misinformation and also places where the general public does not believe the scientific consensus on major issues. And that includes the hot origin of the universe and the Big Bang, evolution by natural selection, the age of the Earth as 4.5 billion years, and of course the current threat to our times of climate change and global warming. This is a problem for civic society when so many people do not believe the scientific consensus on these topics and others. When we look at how people get information, we realize that it's highly stratified. This chart shows how the source of information very much depends on age. The traditional modes of information gathering, such as television and radio, are dominantly used by older people, whereas younger people almost overwhelmingly prefer the internet as a means of getting their information. So when we want to deal with scientific information, we have to recognize that the younger demographics are almost exclusively turning to online sources for their information about everything, including science. We also have to deal with social media. There's been research, illustrated here on the right, that shows that unfortunately, according to this wonderful quote by Jonathan Swift, who didn't know about social media or the internet because this quote was over 300 years old, the truth kind of moves at a steady pace where misinformation flies. And now we know misinformation flies in a viral way on the internet using social media. And so data now shows, using Facebook and other channels, that misinformation has a longer reach and a faster reach to penetrate a large population than scientific truth. And this is most unfortunate. In the histograms on the left, you see that the public generally is not totally trusting of science they find on the internet, with good reason. I did my own survey of this, and it was a bit discouraging. I made a list of the top 100 pseudoscience or fake science or superstition terms I could come up with, and I did an anonymous web search on them. And here you'll see the number of unique web pages that I came out with. Not surprising to most astronomers, vast numbers, tens of millions of pages on UFOs and astrology. But some of these other categories are quite interesting, and just the vast amount of misinformation is staggering. Basically, these 100 terms had 1.3 billion web pages. If I added up the number of science or scientific web pages, it's a smaller number. That's the level of problem we're dealing with. Now, some of this misinformation is fake and just funny, and anyone can tell that it's just wrong and misinformed. But some of it is well dressed up, and that's the misinformation that fools people. These are the conspiracy theories that suck people in, not just in the United States, but around the world. And these are dangerous, because these are causing people not to believe the consensus on climate change, not to believe the efficacy of vaccines, and not to believe fundamental issues of science that have been resolved in the scientific community for decades. And this is the problem that most of us are worried about in the science and education communities. So in my group, we took an intelligent design approach, I'm being humorous there, a machine learning approach of using AI to try and approach this problem. Now obviously journalistic approaches are important too, and on the left you see a schema of how journalists would approach verifying sources, checking information, deciding whether something is a fact or just a rumor or contention or an unsupported piece of evidence. And that's important too. Journalistic standards have to be maintained, and science journalism is always an important part of this landscape. But we decided to create a neural net. A neural net is something that approximates a human brain, where data is put in at the top and goes through a series of neurons, and the weight between the neurons and their connectivity is altered according to the data that's input. And then at the output, the data is translated into either information or misinformation. So we have a machine learning approach where you train a neural net based on a curated set of articles which are categorized a priori as being correct science or incorrect science, and then the neural net goes through its quasi-brain-like learning process to then be able to recognize on a new set of data that has not been tagged or scrutinized by people ahead of time which is misinformation. This is speculative work, it's research, we don't know what the answer will be, but we've had encouraging results. Well, we could test on the low-hanging fruit, and again, I'm being mock humorous here. We could look at QAnon and test it on QAnon, but that's actually pretty easy. I don't think that's much of a challenge, and I don't think we should be proud if our neural net worked to identify QAnon conspiracy theories. In fact, we tested it on two major science topics, on climate change and evolution. In each case, there's a large amount of climate science denial on the internet, in blogs and articles, conspiracy-minded sites, and on evolution, where the counter to evolution is intelligent design, creationism, young earthism. There's plenty of material like that, and we wanted to know if our neural nets could distinguish between it. So we curated modest numbers of articles, 100 or so in each category, hand-selected by smart undergraduate students that were the fake and the real science categories. And we trained the neural net on those. And then we unleashed the neural net on a larger, unidentified set of articles. And we found in this initial experimentation that we could get 90% or higher success with the neural net identifying fake science on climate and fake science on evolution. That's been encouraging enough for us to continue down this road. The next stage will be to unleash this neural net on hundreds of thousands of articles pulled from the common crawl of the web. That's a multi-terabyte database of billions of web pages, essentially the entire internet. And at that point, we'll hand check it with the students to see whether the neural net was working well or not. We hope one neural net will suffice to cover all scientific fields, and that we won't have to train specific internets for each scientific topic. As yet, we don't know the answer to that question. But we believe this is an encouraging approach. It's not going to replace using your brain, or it's not going to replace science journalism, and we can't stop everyone from being naive and falling into the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories. But in the end, this is going to lead to some products. We hope to deploy this in science centers and museums in a gamified interface where people can work in a team or against each other or against the clock to identify fake science in different categories. This is a mock-up of that museum interface. And then the other two tools we're going to aim towards within the next year are a browser extension which will categorize using Bayesian inference from the neural nets that have been trained whether an article that you land on or a website that you land on is information, correct, or misinformation, fake science. And here you see an example from the New York Times, which tends to have legitimate science. We also plan to turn this into a smartphone app, which we can use to crowdsource the classification of real and fake science with people who are trained, or scientists, or students of science. And then we can also unleash on the general public, where we hope to encourage them to play it with their friends and games and make it a social activity. In these ways, we hope to use technology to help to address this pandemic of science misinformation. Thank you.